Good morning. I must confess something rather embarrassing about myself. I am sometimes a bit puzzled or perplexed or even bored that at the time of Advent and Christmas, we read and talk about the same stories about Christ's birth. Sometimes I wonder, do we really need to be reminded of Christ's birth again? Do we have to read the same stories about Jesus' conception, birth, and childhood? Don't we really know it all quite well already? And I know what you think. You're probably not there with me on this. When else shall we tell Christmas stories? How else shall we commemorate Christ's birth in Bethlehem than through plays, songs, and sermons? Instinctively, then, I know that I'm wrong. I still wonder, though. And therefore, today, I would like to engage the gospel text from John's first chapter with this heretical question in mind. What benefit do we gain from our yearly tradition of recalling Christ's birth? Simultaneously, John's prologue also emphasizes that Christ's arrival is in continuation with the religious life in ancient Israel, yet it ushers something new and unpredictable. My talk will thus also revolve around a second question. How is Christ's birth different and yet the same from the life with God in the Old Testament? So hopefully at least somebody can get something from my musings. I have two questions. I'll offer two perspectives on these questions, both interacting with John 1. First, Christians create, or rather should create, a different kind of community than the one that was established in ancient Israel. The Old Testament stories and poems primarily focused on God's dealing with one nation, Israel. Our first reading from the book of Jeremiah underscores this special privilege awarded to Abraham's descendants. When the prophet announces that Israel's upcoming exile in Babylon will not be the end of their story, but the remnant of the people will return to the promised land, the prophet bases this miraculous homecoming on these words. For I have become a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. As was at the time of the exodus from Egypt, thus will be at the time of returning from the exile. God and Israel are bound in a special, unique tie. God is a father to Israel, and Israel, here represented by Ephraim, the northern kingdom, is God's firstborn son. God and Israel have something special. This kind of unique bond between God of the universe and one nation has at least two implications. On the one hand, the imagery of the firstborn son symbolizes that Israel has a special place in God's eyes. Firstborn sons, because they were born first, and therefore spent more time working with and learning from their parents, had more responsibilities and also possessed more privileges. According to the Israelite law, firstborn sons were given a double portion of the inheritance, receiving thus twice more than other sons, and daughters were supposed to marry and enjoy the property of their husbands. Based on this metaphor, Israel is more favored but also more burdened than other nations. It is a privileged group. On the other hand, this illustration from Jeremiah shows that God has other children too. Other nations are not overlooked or, God forbid, damned. They are still God's sons, yet they receive less attention and fewer responsibilities. God's focus is on God's firstborn son, Israel. And one normally becomes a part or became a part of this nation through birth. The picture of God's way of dealing with the world was thus more or less stable and set. Either you were part of those labeled as God's firstborn, or you were not. John's gospel alters this basic dynamic known from the pages of the Old Testament. To begin with, the language is different. The fourth evangelist does not use the word firstborn, as do other New Testament writers, but only born. He uses only born. According to John, God has only one son, namely Jesus, which sets him apart from other people. I think that this is because John wants to highlight the uniqueness of Jesus. In contrast to humans, Jesus enjoys a special, intimate relationship with God that nobody else has. God has only one son, according to John. But all other people, and I mean all other people, can become God's children. This way, anybody, which means Jews and Gentiles, those far away and those close, Americans and Czechs, Republicans and Democrats, can become part of God's nation. Becoming part of God's family now depends on something different than human birth. As John states it, becoming God's child does not depend anymore on bloodline or the will of the flesh or the will of man. Now it depends on God's will and our choice. To all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God. We need God's power to become God's children, but we also need to bring something of our own. Jesus needs to be received. Jesus needs to be believed in. This act of allowing Jesus to radically enter our lives and our families makes us part of God's life and God's family. And this family is bigger, greater, larger than one race and one language. This family is intentionally diverse, uniting people anchored in the faith in Christ, yet representing various backgrounds, thoughts, and positions. A thoughtful 9th century bishop from the region of now modern Turkey, called Theodore Abukura, expresses this notion in a thought-provoking example. Because he led a small community of Christians that at that time lived under Muslim rule, he was forced to come up with creative stories, riddles, and principles to articulate what religion is divine and what religion is merely human. In one such principle, he says, truly divine religion cannot be represented by tribal zeal. It cannot be represented by tribal zeal. By which he meant that if I congregate only with like-minded individuals, then my religion is probably merely human. To socialize only with those who are like me is a natural tendency. A supernatural task is to be united with those who are unlike us. Theodore stresses that God's family is now diverse and cannot be appropriately captured by uniformity. Divine religion is visible in a community that crosses human-made boundaries. It is a diversity, I think, similar to how we sang the penitent song. Diversity in unity. The second point that I would like to emphasize is characterized by the comparison between Moses and Jesus in verse 17. It says, "The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Although these seem contrasts, we should not think that these differing emphases mean opposition. After all, there's no but between them. Law through Moses, but grace and truth through Jesus. Although we often forget it, Jesus also announces future judgment, and Moses' law was established on the idea and experience of God's mercy and truth. Indeed, this notion comes to the forefront in Exodus 33 to 34. It's an incident after the golden calf, when the Israelites fashioned an idol and began to worship it instead of the Lord. God wanted to leave this ungrateful and forgetful group of just released slaves, but Moses took a stand in a growing gap between God and the people. And he interceded for his fellow brothers and sisters, and God relented. But Moses wanted to be sure, so he said, "Show me that you're with us. Show me your glory." To which God responded, "See, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. I will cover you with my hand, and when I pass, I will take away my hand, and you can see my back, but my face shall not be seen." And it happened. The Lord passed before Moses, God took away his hand, and Moses could see God's back, which led to this proclamation: the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in mercy and truthfulness, keeping mercy for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. These words, especially in their Greek translation, the Septuagint, which I just quoted, powerfully resonate with John's emphasis on Jesus being full of grace and mercy. God revealed to Moses was abounding in mercy and truthfulness. Jesus is full of grace and truth. This is the rock on which both testaments stand. God is full of grace and truth. Yet what Moses could glimpse only from the back, Jesus makes clear straightforwardly. In Jesus, we do not see God's back, but God's face. In Jesus, grace and truth are incarnated. He is not hidden in the cleft of the rock, but he rests on the Father's bosom, close to Father's heart. Again, John highlights this special relationship that the Father and the Son cherish. Interestingly, the word grace does not appear in John's gospel after this moment, but perhaps we can see it in the way Jesus acted with people, how he offers a way forward rather than condemnation to those whom he meets. But the word truth appears frequently in John. Jesus stresses that true worshipers of God are those who revere God in spirit and truth. Jesus promises us that truth will free us. He's the way, the truth, the life. John even speaks about the Spirit as about the Spirit of truth, who will guide us into all the truth. It seems to me then that those who are born of faith should act as Jesus did, with grace and truth. Like Jesus, we should think outside of the box. Like Jesus, we should offer compassion and healing. Like Jesus, we should stand by the truth, whatever it costs. My favorite reformer, John Huss, who lived in Prague at the end of the 14th century, expressed this last detail most succinctly. He was known to say, "Seek the truth, Listen to the truth. Teach the truth. Love the truth. Abide by the truth. And defend the truth unto death. Huss reminds us that we need to hold on to the truth so tightly that nothing can separate us from it, because truth and Jesus are one. Truth and grace should be then guiding principles of those who take seriously Christ's birth, even if it costs our life. T.S. Eliot, in his Christmas-oriented poem Journey of the Magi, expresses this last detail in a profound way. This beautifully composed poem describes an imaginary journey of the Magi who went to seek Jesus. After a treacherous and demanding trek, they finally found Jesus, although this detail is mentioned almost in passing, as if significant things in life should be expressed chastely. When these foreigners eventually returned home to their previous customs and cultures, they suddenly couldn't find peace there anymore. They came home, yet they lived now among strangers clutching to their gods. They did not feel at home anymore because something had changed in them. One of the Magi expresses this uncanny feeling this way: I had seen birth and death, but had thought that they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. Perhaps then we celebrate Christmas every year not for information, but for transformation. Perhaps our customs in Advent and during the 12 days of Christmas are not primarily meant to tell us about Christ's birth, but point to our birth. Perhaps we celebrate Christmas year after year because we need to be reminded that we need to be born again, and this act is not exhausted by one moment when we said yes to Jesus in the past. Because we too often, I think, slip into a lifestyle that tries to bring God's kingdom through human means. We make God's family look like us instead of intentionally cultivating diversity in unity. We easily stray away from Jesus' way of grace and truth rather than living these values in a deep, existential way. Because we forget that truly remembering Christ's birth costs life. Therefore, I think it makes wonderful sense to celebrate this peculiar and challenging birth again and again. So, from now on, I will look forward to another round of Christmas stories and songs. I shall be glad of another death.